Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Installing Windows 7 lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, we'll begin by identifying the Windows 7 requirements that you must adhere to before you embark on your Windows 7 journey. You'll learn about some upgrade and migration limitations that are inherent in the different editions of the product. Speaking of editions, you'll learn how to upgrade between different Windows 7 editions, such as upgrading from Windows 7 Home Premium to Windows 7 Professional or Ultimate. From there, we'll move on to an actual installation of Windows 7 onto a brand new machine, and we'll walk through the entire process from start to finish. Next, since Global Mantic has some existing Windows Vista machines, it's important to understand how to upgrade those machines in place from Windows Vista to Windows 7. As such, we will do so in this lesson. However, some of those users can't afford to have any loss in the event that there's a problem with Windows 7. So you'll learn how to dual boot your Windows 7 machines with Windows Vista or Windows XP, or really any other operating system. Since you can't upgrade directly from Windows XP to Windows 7, you will learn how to migrate your Windows XP systems to Windows 7, including user files. Speaking of which, you will learn how to migrate your full user profiles using a tool called Windows Easy Transfer. We'll then touch on another tool called the User State Migration tool, but we won't be covering it in depth in this lesson because that's really a deployment tool that we'll discuss in the deployment lesson in this course. Windows 7 really is the first version of Windows that's capable of unseating the ubiquitous Windows XP as the corporate standard. You should understand that Windows XP is no longer under active development. This can lead to possible security holes as Microsoft really has shifted their focus to Windows 7 machines. So, by staying on Windows XP, Global Mantic would leave itself in harm's way for potential security issues down the line. As most people know, Windows Vista has really proven to be a non-starter for many organizations. Although Windows Vista is used on a few machines in Global Mantic, it's only used where it was absolutely necessary because of particular features or software requirements. In particular, some of Global Mantic's graphics designers had a need to move beyond Windows XP's 4GB memory limit, and the 64-bit edition of Windows XP did not provide enough in the way of software compatibility. In order to be able to get beyond that barrier, these folks did move to Windows Vista 64-bit, and it's been okay for them, but it's not been a great experience, so these groups will move to Windows 7 64-bit. Now, Windows 7 includes powerful new security features that are of high interest to Global Mantic, mainly because of a security breach that the company experienced recently, and because of increased mobile efforts that are underway in the company. Windows 7 has a lot more in the way of mobility than older versions of Windows. As part of the Global Mantic pilot project, there will be a combination of installations, including the new installation that we talked about earlier. Existing Windows Vista machines will simply be upgraded to Windows 7, and the app should already work. Windows XP machines will dual boot with Windows 7. We'll show you a dual boot scenario, and you'll also see a migration scenario from Windows XP to Windows 7. We'll start out by talking about Windows 7 requirements. Different versions of Windows 7 do have different hardware requirements, and we'll see some of those hardware requirements in the next slide. Microsoft makes available a tool called the Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor that verifies that your hardware is ready for Windows 7, checks your installed software to make sure that there are no known compatibility issues with that software in Windows 7, and then if there are problems found and there are solutions available, those solutions are presented to you so that you can take possible action to correct that deficiency. The Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor is very useful and is available as a free download from Microsoft. The link to the Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor is found on the resources page at the end of this lesson. I'm going to move to the next slide so we can look at the Windows 7 requirements matrix, and then we're going to move over to a Windows Vista machine and run the Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor. As you can see here, there are 6 editions of Windows 7 that we've discussed previously. Every edition requires at least a 1 GHz or faster minimum processor. It's really hard to find that slow of a processor these days, so if you have a new system, it's much more likely to be faster. The two lowest editions of Windows 7 each require 512 megabytes of RAM, mainly because they have either no or very limited support for Windows Aero, which is Windows 7's graphical interface. The higher editions of Windows 7, including Home Premium, Professional, Enterprise, and Ultimate, the 32-bit editions, Microsoft recommends a minimum of 1 gigabyte of RAM for the 32-bit edition, or for the 64-bit edition, 2 gigabytes of RAM. My personal recommendation is to add 1 gigabyte to these as a real minimum. 2 gigs for 32-bit, 3 gigs for 64-bit. RAM is cheap these days, so it's really in your best interest to make sure you have plenty of RAM, not just a minimum to run Windows 7. From a disk space perspective, the 32-bit edition of Windows 7 requires 16 gigabytes of available space, and the 64-bit edition requires 20 gigabytes of available space. Given the fact that hard drive manufacturers these days are creating 2 terabyte disks, with one company currently working on a 3 terabyte disk, 20 gigs is not that big a deal. From a graphics perspective, the Starter and Home Basic editions, again, because of their lack of full Aero experience, which is a really nice experience in Windows 7, require just a basic DirectX 9 graphics processor. The other editions of Windows 7, if you plan to use Aero, do require a DirectX 9 graphics processor with what's called WDDM. This is an advanced display technology that's used by Aero in Windows 7. While we're talking about requirements, let's move over to an existing Windows Vista machine and install and run the Windows Upgrade Advisor tool. Here we are on a Windows Vista machine where it's on GlobalMantic-V-075, V is for Vista. And you'll see that on the desktop, I've already downloaded and saved the download for Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor. I'm going to double click that to install the file and click Run. This will start the installation process for the tool. On the first page of the tool is the license agreement, so just choose that you accept the license and click Install. The installation process is a relatively short one, doesn't take that long. So we'll let it run. And now it tells you that we have successfully installed the Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor tool. You'll see that it added an icon to the desktop. I'm going to double click that icon. And this will start the Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor tool that we can use to see if our Windows Vista machine is ready for Windows 7. Now, one of the notes you'll see here is it says make sure to connect and turn on all of your devices so the Upgrade Advisor can check them as well. This means that if you have a printer or if you have a scanner or a webcam, make sure that that device is connected and turned on so the Upgrade Advisor can tell you whether or not there are Windows 7 drivers available for that particular device. I'm going to click the Start Check button to begin the process. Now, this process does take a few minutes, particularly if you have a lot of software installed or you have quite a few hardware devices. And as you can see, it tells you that it's checking compatibility and that it will take a few minutes to complete. That was pretty quick. So here we are. It tells us that we have a number of issues that we found with this particular system. There are upgrade options available. I can upgrade to the 64-bit edition of Windows 7 Enterprise. Now, the reason for that is because I'm running the Enterprise edition of Windows Vista on this machine, and the only upgrade path between Enterprise editions is to go Enterprise to Enterprise. We'll be talking about upgrade paths again in just a couple of minutes. You'll notice that I can't run Windows Aero on this machine. The current graphics adapter won't support the full Windows Aero experience. If I wanted the Aero experience, I'd have to get a new graphics adapter to get an upgrade. This is a virtual machine. I'm not too worried about the full Aero experience because it works well enough for my needs. I have only 1 gigabyte of RAM in this machine. This PC needs at least 2 gigabytes of RAM for the full 64-bit Windows 7 optimal performance. So I could add another gigabyte of RAM if I wanted to, but I'm not going to because, again, for the needs I have here, 1 gig of RAM is perfectly adequate. If I was going to be using this machine day to day in production, I would have at least 3 gigs of RAM in this machine. Now notice that it also tells you that the Windows Mail and Parental Controls web filtering tools are no longer included in Windows 7. This is nice to know because if you're upgrading systems, particularly home systems, you want to understand what's not included anymore, particularly if you are relying on those features. Global Mantix does not use Windows Mail or parental control, so this is not an issue. And you can see that there are additional links that are found here. If I click the See All System Requirements, it tells me that my CPU speed is 2.7 gigahertz, and I need at least 1 gigahertz. And I have 92.1 gigabytes of free disk space available on drive C. I need at least 20 gigs for Windows 7. If I wanted to, I could save this report for future reference, or I could print it if I wanted to include it in a file. That's pretty quick. That was very fast. Tells me right away that with the exception of the graphics adapter and the RAM, this machine can run Windows 7. The RAM would be a very easy fix. The graphics adapter would also be a relatively easy fix. I'm not going to fix either one of those for these demonstrations because there's truly no need for this particular use case. You just got done looking at what was possible with one particular system as far as an upgrade goes, but there are some other upgrade limitations that you should understand before you just go out and start upgrading machines in the organization. First of all, you cannot upgrade from a 32-bit to a 64-bit system. To do so, you have to perform a complete new installation of the system. So you can't take a Windows Vista Enterprise 32-bit system, put the Windows 7 64-bit Enterprise CD in the drive, and expect that the machine's going to upgrade from Windows Vista 32-bit to Windows 7 64-bit. The only way that works is to do a complete new installation. You cannot upgrade from Windows XP and earlier versions of Windows to Windows 7. If you want to move from those editions, Windows XP, Windows 2000, what have you, to Windows 7, you must perform what Microsoft calls a migration. This consists of 2 steps. You start by doing a new installation on your hardware. Now, this can consist of brand new hardware. You might buy a brand new system for Windows 7, or you may install in a dual boot configuration where you install an additional Windows 7 partition on your system side by side with your Windows XP partition. In either case, it's still a brand new installation of Windows, even if it's not on brand new hardware. Once you have that new installation of Windows 7 up and running, you have to move the user files from Windows XP to the new Windows 7 system, and we'll be talking about how to do that particular user file migration later in this lesson. For many Windows 7 editions, Microsoft also makes it easy to move between Windows 7 editions using what's called the Windows Anytime upgrade. For example, you may want to upgrade from Windows Home Premium to Windows Ultimate in a particular scenario. You can upgrade to these more feature-filled editions of Windows 7 on the fly. Again, just like as is the case when you move from Windows Vista to Windows 7, you can't do a 32-bit to 64-bit installation through an Anytime upgrade. You can only upgrade 32-bit to 32-bit or 64-bit to 64-bit. You can't upgrade from 32-bit to 64-bit or downgrade from a 64-bit edition to a 32-bit edition. Further, you can't downgrade at all. If you're running Windows 7 Ultimate, you can't run a Windows Anytime downgrade to move down the edition chart. You can only move up the edition chart when it comes to a Windows 7 Anytime upgrade. We'll look at a Windows 7 Anytime upgrade later on. On this chart, here's a list of the upgrade paths that are allowed with Windows 7. You can move from Windows Vista Home Basic to Windows 7 Home Basic, or Home Premium, or Ultimate. That's the upgrade path that's allowed. You can move from Windows Vista Home Premium to Windows 7 Home Premium or Windows 7 Ultimate. On the Business Edition, you can move to the Professional, Enterprise, or Ultimate editions of Windows 7. If you're already running Enterprise, your only upgrade path available is to upgrade to Windows 7 Enterprise. If you try to do a Windows 7 Anytime upgrade, you can upgrade from Starter to Home Premium, Professional, or Ultimate. Home Basic, again, Home Premium, Professional, or Ultimate. If you're running Home Premium, you can upgrade to either Professional or the Ultimate Edition, or from the Professional Edition to the Ultimate Edition, or from the Enterprise Edition to an Enterprise Edition or Ultimate. If you're already running Ultimate, you're already where you can be. You have the Ultimate version of Windows 7. In order to begin lab testing, GlobalMantix wants to start with some installations of Windows 7s in a number of different scenarios. We'll start by looking at a completely clean installation of Windows 7 on a new machine with no existing operating system. From there, we'll move on to a dual boot installation which runs two operating systems side by side on the same computer. Next, you'll get to walk through an in-place upgrade from Windows Vista to Windows 7 scenario, and we'll end by doing a migration to upgrade to Windows 7 from Windows Vista or Windows XP. In the case of this lesson, we'll be doing a Windows XP to Windows 7 migration. All of these scenarios are in use in various places at GlobalMantix, so it's important to understand all four of these types of installation methods so that you can have the best possible rollout plan for Windows 7 for the organization. There are a couple of different installation types for Windows 7 machines. The first installation type is a standard installation. For the initial phase of the pilot project being covered in this lesson, we're going to focus on standard installations. This is where you sit in front of the monitor and you walk through a series of prompts to get to a new machine that's installed with Windows 7. The second kind of installation, which is what we ultimately want to get to for GlobalMantix, is called an unattended installation. This allows an IT administrator to have a mostly hands-off installation for Windows 7. After all, who wants to walk around to 700 machines and upgrade them manually when it can be done in a centralized, automated way? We'll be covering automated installations in the Deploying Windows 7 Machines lesson in this course. When it comes to an installation, there are a number of different ways you can go about getting the media for Windows 7 loaded onto a system. For your pilot rollouts, the most common way to do this is going to be with a DVD. The DVD is included in a Windows 7 retail box, and a lot of IT folks create DVDs after downloading the ISO image file from Microsoft's site and burning that ISO to a disk. An ISO file is generally used by those that have Microsoft licensing agreements. An ISO is an image of a CD-ROM or DVD device that you then burn to a blank disk so you actually have a complete copy of the original CD or DVD. You can also use a USB flash drive or whatever you like to customize the installation source. Perhaps you want to make a change to what you're going to be installing. You want to do what's called slipstreaming drivers. Whatever. You can actually use a USB drive for Windows 7 installations. When it comes to automated installations, you often use an actual network share that has all of the Windows 7 source files, and then they're then sucked over the network to a new machine. In this lesson, we'll be using both the DVD and the ISO options in a couple of different ways. We'll be mounting the ISO files into a virtual machine that will then look like a DVD drive to the virtual machines to which we'll be installing Windows 7. I'm now going to move over to my Hyper-V server and we're going to install a brand new Windows 7 machine from scratch. As you can see, I've already got my machine created. This is a machine called GM-7-100 and it's not started yet, but I want to show you that I've mounted the ISO file as a disk on this machine. And as you can see here, this is a 32-bit edition of Windows 7. And I've installed that, I basically mounted that ISO as a CD-ROM drive device as a DVD device on this virtual machine. From here, I would power on the virtual machine by clicking Start. This is akin to turning on the power supply on a regular PC. So basically what I've done is I've inserted the DVD disc in the DVD drive, and now I'm turning the machine on. So I'm clicking the Start button. You can see that it's then starting the virtual machine named GM-7-100 and going through the BIOS and the boot process. I want to get this to a point where we can actually see it. I'm now going to go full screen so we can see everything a little bit better. Now you'll notice that it's going through the starting Windows task here. It's just like it would when it's going to start booting Windows, but it's going to come to a point where we have some other things taking place. As you can see, the first screen you get in Windows 7 asks you for the language information and basically some locality information that the Windows installer needs to know before you continue. What language are you using? Well, I happen to speak English. What time and currency format do you want to use? And what kind of keyboard are you using? I'm in the Midwest. I think I'll stick with the US keyboard. So I'm going to enter this information and click Next to continue. Now the next thing you're going to notice, if you've installed previous versions of Windows, you had a few more things you had to answer. Well, now it's as simple as clicking Install Now. From here, the Windows 7 installation process really becomes pretty seamless. And you're going to notice that you get a note here saying setup is starting. And what's happening in the background is Windows 7 is loading everything that it needs from the DVD drive. And it's going to begin the installation, starting with making sure that you've read the license terms. I am accepting the license terms. If you don't accept them, you can't continue. And I'll click Next. You have two options here. We talked about these before. One is to do an upgrade. We're not going to do an upgrade because there's no existing operating system. The other one is to do a custom installation. So I'm going to go ahead and do that because that's basically the only way you can install a brand new copy of Windows. We'll be doing another installation in a little while that will use the upgrade path. To which disk do I want to install Windows? I have only one disk, but if I wanted to, I could partition this disk into smaller pieces. I'm not going to, but I wanted you to see that there are some options here for being able to partition the disk. I could delete the currently existing partition, format it, do a new partition, extend it, and a number of other things. If I just click Next, what will happen is Windows 7 will create a single partition and just use all of the disk space for the primary Windows 7 installation. That's what I want to do for this particular installation. In some cases, this is not very typical on desktop machines, but it is more typical on server machines. It's possible that Windows 7 will not have a driver that will allow you to see the storage. For example, suppose on a server you're using RAID. Now, some desktop machines use RAID as well, hardware RAID. If you're not seeing any storage devices and you know your machine has a hard drive, you may need to get a Windows 7 driver for your disk controller, your RAID controller, or your SATA controller, or your IDE controller, and then use that disk that came with that controller and load the Windows 7 driver. So make sure that if you don't see a disk device, that you don't it's not just a simple driver issue. If you have to load a driver, click the Load Driver button, and then walk through the whole process you see here. You can browse pretty much anywhere you want, from the boot device, from a CD-ROM drive, or even from a floppy disk. So you can use a floppy disk, a CD disk. Really, those are the only two options you'd have, although if you had a USB drive plugged in, the system would see that as well. Whoops. By doing that, I messed up my installation, so I'm going to restart. So we'll do Install Now. We'll accept the license terms, do a custom installation. I'm just going to click Next here. And from here on, it's pretty automated. There's 5 steps. It's going to copy the Windows files from the CD-ROM drive to the hard drive, so that's a quicker installation. From there, it does what's called expand the Windows files. The files as they're stored on the DVD disk are actually compressed. So what happens in this stage is Windows 7 expands those files so that it can use them for installation. The system then installs all of the Windows 7 features and updates, and then the installation is completed, and we'll be walking through that process in just a few minutes. At the end of this process, the system will automatically reboot, and it'll come up to a login screen that you'll see in a little bit. At this point, I'm going to pause the video because this process takes more than a few minutes, so I don't want you to have to sit here and just simply watch the installation screen as it scrolls by. So I'm going to pause the video, and once the installation is complete, we'll come back and continue on. And we're back. Once the process is finished, you start with a sort of login screen that asks you to provide a username that you're going to use for this computer. To start with, I'm just going to type Scott for my username, and I'm going to name this machine GM-7-100. This is going to be the 100th machine on the Global Mantix network, and it'll be running Windows 7. And click Next. You have to have a password for every user that you have on your computer. in Windows 7, when you do a brand new installation, you're also asked for a password hint that's required. This will help you if you forget your password and you need to have a quick reminder of what that is. I don't generally use password hints myself, but in some cases you can type a password hint that will help you. In a domain environment like Global Mantic, this is not going to be of much use after this machine is joined to the Global Mantic domain, so don't worry too much about it. Windows Update is a pretty good tool. It helps keep your computer protected by making sure that any new updates that Microsoft releases for Windows 7 are automatically downloaded and installed to your computer. I'm going to use the default Windows 7 settings will automatically update my machine. I'm also going to set my time zone to Central Time since that's where I live, and click Next. Windows has different firewall tools that will allow you to set different firewall rules for various locations. Particularly if you're using a mobile machine, these are useful. Since this is a desktop machine, I'm just going to choose the work network and we'll move on. And then you'll see that Windows is finalizing my settings. And it's doing the little welcome thing here, the spinny circle. And it's getting ready for basically a first time use. Now the first thing that's going to happen is the machine is going to download and install updates to your machine. If you want to see the progress of those updates, you can see right here that there are 303K worth of updates and there's only 2 updates that are going to be downloaded. And it's 31% complete. A restore point is generally created before a set of updates is installed, because if there happens to be a bad update, you can actually roll back to that restore point if there's a problem. Some updates require you to reboot your machine. These ones do. I'm going to pause the video while this machine reboots, and when we come back, we'll go over some additional items you should configure immediately after the machine is rebooted and created. You'll notice that we get to a login screen as soon as this machine reboots, and here's where I need to type my password to log in to the new Windows 7 machine that we just created on the Hyper-V server. And you can see we have pretty much the default Windows settings, the default Windows background. Everything's here exactly as we would expect. If we look at some of the Windows 7 settings by going to Start menu, right-click Computer, and choose Properties, we'll see that we're running a 32-bit edition of Windows 7, and the computer name is GM7100. We have a gig of RAM, running Windows 7 Enterprise on a machine with a 2.66 GHz Xeon processor. What's most important is this workgroup information and the activation information below. One of the things you may have noticed during the installation is you were not prompted for a product key as you used to be in older versions of Windows. Before we continue, notice that when you install new updates in Windows 7, you get a little window that tells you exactly what the updates were that were installed. We'll be talking about updates later in this course again, but I wanted you to see that since it popped up. If you want to activate Windows, you have to click the Activate link you see on this screen. And you have to activate Windows within 30 days, or some features will stop working and eventually the system won't work at all. You can activate Windows Online, and it's going to verify your product key. Well, I don't have a product key installed yet. You'll notice there's a little link here that says Change Product Key. This is where I'll type my Windows 7 product key, and then I'll click Next and move on to the next screen. Now, I'm not allowed to share product key, so I'm actually going to put the product key in right now, and then I'm going to click Next. But I'm going to pause the video to do that, so when you come back to the video, we'll be on the next screen. Now, what happens on the next screen once you click Next is it's going to verify that product key, and it can take a few minutes while it goes out and checks with Microsoft servers to make sure that the key that I've typed is actually valid and that it's not stolen from somewhere. So it is true, it can take a few minutes, and it is taking a few minutes. Look at that. It was successful. So at this point, this machine has been activated. Understand there are two different types of product keys with Windows 7. One is called an MAK, or multiple activation key. That's what I used here. This is for the enterprise license. There's another kind of license that's used in larger organizations called a KMS key. That's a key management server. We have not done key management servers here. From a pure desktop perspective, it doesn't really matter which one you use, except in large organizations you have to use KMS, and other organizations you can use the MAC keys or the MAK keys. For the purposes of the course, it doesn't matter which key you use, is what I should say. We're just going to go on. It doesn't matter how Windows gets activated as long as it gets activated. Now Windows 7 is activated as it should be. And you can see that Windows is activated now. Now the other thing you're going to notice is that we're not a part of the Global Mantix domain. We're still part of Workgroup. We should fix that. The first thing we need to do is make sure that the Global Mantix system IP address is set to a valid DNS server. So I'm going to change the network configuration. If you don't follow what I'm doing right now, don't worry about it, because we're going to be discussing networking fully in the networking component of this course. What I'm doing right now, as I'm going to the local area connection, and I'm changing the DNS server to point to an Active Directory server in the organization. If I don't do that, then I can't actually connect to the domain, and I won't be able to join this machine. Most times you won't have to do this, but understand that if you're having trouble joining an Active Directory domain, that you may have to manually type in the address of the DNS server or the Active Directory domain controller that you want to use, which is what I have to do here. Once that's done, when I get over here, I'm going to click Change Settings. And I'm going to go to the rename this computer or change its domain. I want to have it join the Global Mantix domain. Once it identifies a domain controller for the domain, you'll notice that it pops up a username and password that you have to ask the domain controller if this machine is allowed to join the domain. By providing the credentials for a user that has the authority to add a machine to the domain, you allow this new Windows 7 machine to become a part of the Active Directory domain. And once it gets complete, you'll get a little welcome message here that says, "Welcome to the globalmantix.com domain." When you're done, you have to restart your computer to apply the changes. So I'm going to click OK and close. And I'm just going to do a restart later, and we'll go back over to, and when I come back, I'll basically log in to the domain, and we'll be doing a lot of this later on in the course, so I'm not going to beat this to death, but I want you to understand that at this point, the machine is ready to use on the Global Mantix domain. You just got to see a fresh installation, and you can probably tell that it's a pretty easy process. Next, Global Mantix has a desire to be able to upgrade some existing Windows Vista machines that are running the 64-bit edition of Vista to a 64-bit edition of Windows 7. Remember, only the Windows Vista operating system supports an in-place upgrade to Windows 7. For every other scenario, you have to do an actual migration from the old operating system to Windows 7. At the end of this upgrade, the system's going to operate just like it used to, except that this time it'll be running Windows 7. All of your documents, files, and applications remain intact and in place, with one caveat. If you have applications that are not compatible with Windows 7, they will move over to the new Windows 7 machine, but they won't run. So just be aware of that, and make sure you use the Upgrade Advisor tool that we talked about before. If the upgrade just happens to fail completely, the system will roll back to Windows Vista. So from that aspect, there's not a huge risk, although in any upgrade, there is a risk of data loss. So the first thing you should do is back up your system before you do a full upgrade. With the Windows 7 new installation, we initiated the upgrade by putting the CD-ROM drive into a not running computer and then turning on that computer and running the installation. A Windows Vista to Windows 7 upgrade is actually initiated from a running Windows Vista system. Now this diagram might not make a lot of sense, but later on it will. This signifies the existing Windows Vista installation. This signifies the new Windows 7 installation, and the green color says it's going to be the same system, just running Windows 7. When you see diagrams later on, this will make a little bit more sense. I'm going to go over to a Windows Vista system now, and we're going to kick off this installation, and we're going to see what happens. And here we are on the Vista system on which we ran the Windows 7 Upgrade Advisor tool earlier. And I'd like to show you that this actually has a few documents on it. You'll see that we have a server room documentation, information about the Global Mantic Data Center, and an EBS messaging document. We also have Microsoft Office installed on this machine. In fact, Office 2007 has been recently installed on this computer, including Excel and Word. So if I start Microsoft Office, you'll see that there's already some software that's installed. I'm going to customize. I'm not going to use update right now. So there we go. Now to start the installation, all you've got to do is pop the Windows 7 Upgrade CD or Installation CD into the CD-ROM drive of the machine that you're working with. When that happens, the autoplay process will kick off and you'll be able to run the setup.exe tool. You can see that this is my DVD-ROM drive, and that's drive D. So I'm going to click the Run Setup.exe option on this screen. And if I wanted to, I could run the compatibility check right from here. I'm not going to worry about that because I've already run the Upgrade Advisory tool. But I'm going to click Install Now. Setup will start, as you can see, by copying some temporary files from the installation media to the hard drive, and then the actual setup process will just start, just like it did with the new Windows 7 installation. When you do an upgrade, one of the first things you get is an option to download updated installer tools that may have newer code than the version you're running. Do you want updates for the installation? Well, it's a good thing to do that because then you know you have all of the latest information that you need to do the upgrade properly. And as you can see here, it's downloaded about a megabyte worth of updates, and that's going to restart the installation process with the new installer tools. Now, this may be security fixes, it may be performance fixes, it could be a reliability fix. Maybe Microsoft found a flaw in the upgrade tool, the installation tool, so that was their fix. Just like was the case before, you have licenses you need to agree to, so we'll agree to the license and click Next. This time, we're going to upgrade to a newer version of Windows, and we're going to keep our files, settings, and programs intact. Again, this option is only available when there's an existing version of Windows running, and Microsoft does recommend you back up your files before you proceed. So I'm going to choose the upgrade path. And what's going to happen here is the Windows needs to be restarted so changes to system files can be made. Now, it's possible that the installation upgrade that we did changed the system file, so the system needs to be rebooted. So we're going to close the installer. And I'm going to reboot the system, and we'll come back and we'll kick off the installation again. We're logging in as the administrator account for the domain. This is a domain-joined machine. This is an existing machine in the Global Mantic Active Directory domain, so that's why we're logging into the domain. I'm going to close this initial screen, and we'll go to the Start menu, choose Computer, and I'll double-click the DVD-ROM device again, and we'll go through and begin the Windows installation anew now that it's updated itself and rebooted to clear up any problems or conflicts with system files. We don't need to get updates again, so I'm going to choose to not get the updates. Again, we'll agree to the license terms and click Next. Choose the upgrade option, and again, it's going to check compatibility to make sure that there's nothing egregious going on. And we're going to get that same report we got before that basically says Windows Mail doesn't work anymore, but we're not going to worry about that because Global Mantic is not using Windows Mail. Click Next. This time, instead of saying installing Windows, we're seeing upgrading Windows. But it's a similar screen to what you saw during the installation process we went through just a few minutes ago. This time, we're going to have it copying Windows files. It's going to gather information from this system, expand the Windows files, install features and updates, and then transfer your file settings and programs to the new operating system so that everything works just like it should. Now again, this process can take a while, so I'm not going to have you sit here and watch while the percentage increases. I'm going to go pause the video, and we'll come back when something interesting happens. I thought this would be a good spot to at least show you where the process was so far. What's happened is the system's completed copying Windows files and gathering the files and settings and program information that it needs in order to perform the upgrade. After that was done, the system rebooted into a mini shell sort of Windows, and it's now moving on to expand the new Windows 7 files, after which it will install the features and updates and then transfer all the information that it grabbed out of the Windows Vista installation. With the upgrade mostly complete now, you're being asked to answer just a few questions about how you want Windows 7 to act. First of all, we've talked about Windows updates and their importance a little bit so far in this lesson. We'll be talking about Windows updates much more later on in this course. For now, I'm just going to choose to use the recommended Windows update settings. Again, we're asked to choose a time zone. Because I upgraded from a different machine, it chose my time zone correctly because it just grabbed that setting from the old version of Windows. If this was a new installation, you remember that it defaults to the UTC-8 or Pacific time zone. And from here, I'm told I need to press Control-Alt-Delete to log in. So I'll do a Control-Alt-Delete. I'm already joined to the domain because the Windows Vista machine was also joined to the domain. And click Next. And you'll be able to see once we get up to the desktop that Microsoft Office and some of those documents that we had on the old version or Windows Vista will have moved over automatically to the new version of Windows 7 here that we have loading right now. I'm going to close the sidebar because I believe it just gets in the way on a smallish monitor. And there are some updates installed. And remember, this is still a new Windows 7 installation, so it has to do some things. And there's a couple of updates, security updates. And I'm going to not reboot right now because I'm not too interested in having those security updates while we continue on with this process. But if you wanted to make sure you were complete, let the updates run and then reboot. Now I'm going to go to right-click my computer and choose Properties. And you'll see that I am a member of the Global Mantrix domain, but I want to get rid of the V here in my computer name and replace it with a 7. So I'm going to change settings and change my machine name to GM-7-075, and I'll stay in the domain. And in order to make a machine name change stick, you have to restart the machine. I'm going to choose Restart Later, and we'll do that before we go. But I want you to see that my applications came over as well. Microsoft Office is here, just like it should be. So I can open Microsoft Word 2007. Now notice I did not install that application on Windows 7. That was already installed on Windows Vista and it came over. I also go to my documents and you'll see that those documents that I had on Windows Vista also came over from the Windows Vista installation. So this upgrade process pulled all my settings over from Windows Vista, including my documents and my files, and as well as all of my applications. So basically this in-place upgrade allowed me to basically go from Windows Vista to Windows 7 without any hassle really at all. Now if I reboot, you'll see that when it's done rebooting, that this is now named GM-7-075. This up here doesn't really mean anything. It's just what it's called in Hyper-V, and I'll change that as soon as we're done here. Actually, I'll change it while it's rebooting. So if I go to Hyper-V, I'll change this to GM-7. Now that's running Windows 7. It's booting. And I just want to show you the computer information detail so you can see that this name change actually did take and that we're in good shape here. Now the reason you're seeing this is because it was finishing installing those two updates, and it's going to take it just a second. I've got to log in. And I'll go to my computer here and choose Properties. And you'll see that the computer name is now GM7075. This is good. So, the upgrade completed. We changed the machine name to reflect the new version of Windows. Now, most organizations don't put the version of Windows in their machine name. I'm only doing it for the Global Mantic project because it makes it easier to track what version of Windows each of the machines that we're using is running, and so that we can see what's going on a little bit easier. We just got done upgrading a Windows Vista machine to Windows 7, but you know already you can't upgrade Windows XP directly to Windows 7. There may be times when you want to maintain that Windows XP installation at the same time you have users testing Windows 7, but you want to give them a fallback in case they run into problems with Windows 7. This is where dual booting comes in. Dual booting allows users to select the operating system that will be loaded at boot time. During the early pilot phase of Global Mantic's Windows 7 implementation project, the company is going to use this dual booting mechanism between some Windows XP and Windows 7 systems. Again, this will make it easier for staff to revert to Windows XP in the event of an unanticipated problem. In order to be able to dual boot, the computer has to meet one of the following goals. It has to have either 2 hard drives or enough space on a single hard drive in which to create a second partition to which the Windows 7 operating system will be installed. We'll be discussing partitions in the lesson entitled Understanding Windows 7 Storage. You don't have to just use Windows in order to dual boot, however. Windows 7 can actually dual boot or run side by side with a variety of operating systems, including the aforementioned Windows XP and Vista, but also Linux and others. There are some steps that you have to take in order to be able to begin the dual booting process. You have to make sure you've got your Windows 7 media and product key available. And then you have to do one of the following. You have to either partition the hard drive to make the existing hard drive to make room for the new Windows 7 installation, or you have to add a second hard drive. I can tell you right now that partitioning an existing hard drive, if your goal is to make darn sure you don't lose your stuff, is incredibly dangerous. You can and you will lose stuff if you're not careful. There is a tool called gparted. It's an open source partition editor tool that will allow you to resize your Windows XP partition to make it smaller so that there's enough space on which to add the Windows 7 operating system. Use this tool with caution. I have broken systems with it before and I know how to use it. If you don't know how to use it, be very careful. I always recommend that you install Windows 7 onto a new hard drive. Even for myself, when I go to a new operating system and my office system at work, I do not do a repartition. I actually always add a second hard drive, get everything working, copy everything over, do a migration, and only then, once I know everything's working, do I even try to mess around by taking that first hard drive out of the system. Once you're through getting everything working under the dual boot, you've got Windows XP and you've got Windows 7 dual booting happily, you got to choose the default operating system, and I'll show you how to do that. I want to have a couple of notes for you here that are important to understand when you're doing the dual boot thing. First of all, the new Windows 7 installation is a new installation. It's not an upgrade. You can't upgrade Windows XP to Windows 7. And even if you're doing the dual boot, you cannot upgrade that machine to Windows 7. That is, if you've got a Vista system and you're trying to get to Windows 7 and you decide to do a dual boot, it's not going to move any of the information from the Windows Vista side of the house to Windows 7. It's always going to be considered a new application, a new installation. As such, your applications need to be reinstalled, and your user profiles and your data need to somehow be migrated to the new system. We'll be talking about migrating profiles in the next section of this course. This diagram is intended to show you what a Windows XP to Windows 7 dual boot would look like. The round box here is a system, is a single computer. Here is a single computer as well. It's the same computer. The Windows XP installation simply sits there and doesn't get touched as part of this process. What we're doing is we're adding a second hard drive, and we're going to do a Windows 7 installation to that second hard drive. And the reason that I've chosen a blue color for the Windows 7 installation is to differentiate it from the Windows XP installation. It is a different installation. There's nothing in common except the fact that they're running on the same computer, but they're not running at the same time. They're only running one or the other, your choice upon boot. So understand that when the Windows XP side of this is going to stay exactly as it does right now. We're just going to kind of shoehorn Windows 7 into the equation. Now, we're going to go back over to the Hyper-V server that I'm using, and we're going to install Windows 7 as a second operating system onto a virtual machine. Here we are. We're going to use the virtual machine name GM-X-032. Now, one of the things I want to point out is this is going to be the virtual machine name. This has nothing to do with the name of the machine that we create inside the virtual machine. This is just an identifier for Hyper-V. This could say the virtual machine Snoopy is turned off, but the system name itself to Windows is GM-X-032. I am not going to partition my disks. I'm instead using two hard drives. You can see here that the first hard drive is listed here and the second hard drive is listed here. Again, I don't like partitioning hard drives if I can avoid it for an existing system. I don't like to repartition the hard drives for existing systems. I've already got the Windows 7 CD inserted into this machine. So I'm just going to go ahead and start up the machine. And we're going to boot from the Windows 7 media. And as you can see, Windows is loading files. And as you've seen already a couple times in this lesson, we're getting a nice familiar starting Windows here that signifies that we're at Windows 7. This is not a Windows XP boot screen that we're looking at. It's going to look just like a new installation for most of this, except where we go to choose to which hard drive we want to install Windows 7. Have to accept the terms of the license, so we'll do that. We're going to do a custom installation, just like we did with our initial installation to a brand new machine. And notice now we have basically three choices to which to install Windows. We have Disk 0 Partition 1, which is our existing system partition. So this is the one that is already running Windows XP. We have an 11 meg unallocated space here that we're just going to ignore for now. And we have Disk 1 unallocated space. So we have Disk 0 and Disk 1. So if we click Drive Options here, I'm going to create a new partition out of that space. So now we have Disk 0 and Disk 1. The name on each one is Partition 1. This is a primary partition. You'll learn more about primary partitions later on in this course. So, Windows XP will sit on Disk 0. Windows 7 will sit on Disk 1. We'll click Next. From here, the installation process is going to be identical to what it was in the initial portion of this lesson where we install the new system. So I'm going to pause this lesson while this process finishes, and then we're going to come back and we're going to take a look at this system. Now you got to see this before, so I'm just going to provide a username and a computer name. This is going to be GM-7-101. And click Next. Password. And I'm going to use the recommended settings for Windows Update. And again, I'm going to change the clock to Central Time. This will be the work network. And Windows will now finalize my settings. You'll notice that there are two hard drives in this machine. Drive C is Windows 7, and Drive D became, in this particular installation, became Windows XP. And the way you can tell is Windows XP uses this Documents and Settings folder name in order to store users' documents and settings. And Windows 7 uses the shortcuts that to be called users. So, both of these operating systems are running on this machine. That's pretty cool. I'm going to actually reboot this machine, and so I'm going to pause the video for just a minute while I do that. Now, when I reboot this machine, look what happens. Right after the BIOS gets done doing its system checks, I get this operating system menu that says, what do you want to start? Do you want to start your earlier version of Windows, or do you want to start Windows 7? And if you choose the earlier version of Windows, it'll boot to Windows XP. And when you choose the Windows 7 option, you can boot to Windows 7, or as you see on the screen here, you can press F8 for some additional options. These are some additional options you get when you boot Windows 7 by default. You can get to this menu to enable some additional capability, especially if you're having problems. So basically, by installing Windows 7 side by side with Windows XP, we've gained the ability to boot to both Windows XP and Windows 7. I'm going to restart my machine. And I'm going to choose to start Windows XP. When I choose that option, here is the Windows XP boot screen. So this is something that we've always seen. It's no different than it was before. When the user chooses to boot to Windows XP, it's going to boot to Windows XP. And if we go to my computer here, as is the case with the other system, we have a C and an E drive. Now the difference is, it really doesn't matter. It's just the drive letters change depending on which operating system you're using, because each system sees the drives differently. In this case, however, drive C happens to be the Windows XP partition. Remember, when we were booted to Windows 7, drive C was the Windows 7 partition. Over here, drive E happens to be the Windows 7 partition. So you can see that both systems were able to boot not simultaneously, but side by side. And if you want to see that again, let me just reboot this guy. And you can see it will actually move over to Windows 7, so you can see that we'll boot to Windows 7 as well. Seeing is believing, right? And here's a relatively familiar Windows 7 boot screen. I just made it full screen. That we see with the other option from that boot menu that was just below the previous version of Windows. Pretty cool. And here we are. Now you've already seen that once we installed Windows 7, it became the default operating system. Basically what that means is that when you start the system, if you don't do anything, Windows 7 is going to be the system that starts in 30 seconds. You may not want that behavior. You may want to set the default operating system back to Windows XP. Well, there's a way to do that. We're going to go back over to the machine we've been working with, and we're going to take a look at this. Here we are back at the machine we've been working with, and here's how we do this. There's two ways. You can do it from the command line, or you can do it from the GUI. We're going to start with a control panel applet that will allow you to do this. Really, it's part of the computer management tool, so we're going to right-click Computer and choose Properties. On the Properties page, we'll click Advanced System Settings, and you'll notice there's a Startup and Recovery option. When we click Settings, you'll notice that there's a System Startup Default Operating System option, and when I click the down arrow, we have earlier version of Windows and Windows 7. Now those just happen to correspond to the two items we saw when we rebooted this system earlier, an earlier version of Windows and Windows 7. When you do nothing, the default operating system will boot after 30 seconds. So if you want to set this to earlier version of Windows, then you would just change it to earlier version of Windows and click OK. The system will wait for 30 seconds so you can decide whether or not you want to change that option, after which it'll boot to whatever the default operating system is. You can change the time for how long the list of operating systems is displayed on the screen. Or you can disable that option altogether by disabling the checkbox, and then the system will simply just boot to the default operating system. If you do that, then in order to make the change, in order to boot to the other side of the operating system, you're going to have to come into Control Panel to make the change. So I'm going to leave this checkbox enabled. Now there's also a command line tool called BCD Edit, and you have to use a command prompt that has administrator privileges. So I'm going to go to Start and choose All Programs, Accessories, right-click Command Prompt and choose Run as Administrator. And you'll see that I'm running the command prompt now as an administrative user. The command that I talked about is called BCD Edit. When I just type BCD Edit, it gives me a list of the partitions that I already have on my system. And as you can see, I've got this Boot Manager partition, which isn't really all that interesting. But then I've got the Windows Legacy OS Loader. This is my earlier version of Windows that you see. Then I've got my new Windows bootloader. This is the Windows 7 side of the house. And right now, it is the default operating system. But I can change that by typing BCD Edit /default and then the name or the identifier that's associated with the partition. I gotta type it right though, that usually helps. That I want to boot. So I type BCD Edit /default NTLDR and hit enter. The operation completed successfully. Now you're not going to see much different change here. You're not going to really see anything change. But now when I reboot this system, let's see what happens. Actually, let's see if it changed it here. When we go to the control panel now, it did change it to the earlier version of Windows, just like it should have, because we made that change to the command line. But let's make sure that it really does that. So we choose the restart option, and it'll take it a second to shut down, and then reboot the system after going through its BIOS checks and all that good stuff. And now, before when we started this system, the earlier version of, this Windows 7 option was the one that was highlighted. Now, the earlier version of Windows is highlighted. So that tells you that that BCD Edit tool did exactly what we intended it to do, and that's a good thing. Now that you understand how you get Windows 7 to a different machine, whether it's upgrading a machine, whether it's doing a dual boot, or whether it's doing a brand new installation, it's time to get your old data off Windows XP machines and over to Windows 7 machines. During the upgrade of Windows Vista to Windows 7, you got to see just how nice it was that all of your applications and files moved over with that new installation, because it was able to upgrade the existing Vista installation directly. Unfortunately, Windows XP is not quite as easy, but you still have some tools that make it possible to move user settings and other information. Again, Windows XP, you can't do a direct upgrade. You have to do either a new or clean installation or dual boot the system. After that installation, you have to manually reinstall your applications. There is no way to automatically install the applications directly through an upgrade process. Now, there's lots of enterprise management tools out there that will allow you to manage applications a little easier, but out of the box, Windows 7 has to have all of its applications reinstalled. You can, however, migrate your user profiles and your data to Windows 7 from Windows XP. Now, even if you installed Windows 7 in a dual boot configuration, that is, Windows XP and Windows 7 live on the same computer but just on different hard drives, you still also need to migrate your user profiles and your data, as well as reinstall your applications on that new Windows 7 installation. What you're looking at is on one of these funny charts that I put together. This is your Windows XP machine. This is your Windows 7 machine. The color is just to tell you these are different computers. Green is the Windows XP machine. Blue is Windows 7. You have to find some other way to move the documents and files between the two systems. There's a technique called roaming profiles that some organizations use to mitigate or negate the need for migrating profiles between machines. What the roaming profiles allow you to do is have roving users that can log into any computer in the organization, and all of their files and all of their settings follow them. GlobalMantic does not use roaming profiles because of the significant network requirements that are required for roaming profiles. Roaming profiles can slow things down, so GlobalMantic decided that it's not for them. Local user profiles are very common, and they're sort of the other side of the coin to roaming user profiles. They are static profiles that sit on a single machine, and they include the documents and other files that make up a user's document store, their internet bookmarks, the backgrounds that they use, their email account information, some custom application settings, and some Windows settings. Now, for the initial phase of this pilot project, Global Mantic will migrate a profile from Windows XP to Windows 7, and they'll do that for some users as a part of the overall implementation as well. So you need to understand how to migrate profiles from Windows XP to Windows 7. There is a tool called Windows Easy Transfer that transfers information between different Windows installations. Windows Easy Transfer supports Windows XP, Windows Vista, and Windows 7, and it will allow you to have up to, well, there's a bunch of different installation and data transfer methods that you can choose from. There's this one called an Easy Transfer Cable. This is basically connecting two computers directly to one another over their USB ports. It's also a very fast way to transfer information because the computers are talking directly to each other. You then have the network. The computers can actually talk to a central file share over the network. This is also a very fast way if you have a gigabit or faster network. This is the option that Global Mantic will be using because it's really the easiest one to implement. With an Easy Transfer Cable, the computers have to be sitting right next to one another and they have to both be on. If you have a dual boot configuration, you can't use the Easy Transfer Cable because you can't have both operating systems running at the same time. You can also use a portable hard drive or a CD or DVD media that you burn all of the information to and then reload it on the other machine. We're going to go over to our Windows 7 and Windows XP installation now, and we're going to do a transfer of documents and settings from Windows XP to Windows 7. Here we are on the machine we created as the first exercise in this lesson. This is the brand new Windows 7 machine that we created. If I go to Start, All Programs, Accessories, System Tools, you're going to notice there's an item here called Windows Easy Transfer. I'm going to run Windows Easy Transfer, and you're going to see that there's a whole plethora of things that can be copied between machines. And I'll let you take a look at that, but these are all the things you can transfer. One thing to keep in mind is you cannot transfer your programs. You have to reinstall your programs manually. Only the data will move over, not the programs. I'll click Next. What do you want to use to transfer the items between these computers? An Easy Transfer Cable, your network, or some external storage device? I'm going to use the network. Which computer am I using? This is my new computer, so I'm going to choose this is my new computer. I have not yet installed Windows Easy Transfer on my old computer, so I'm going to choose I need to install it now. How do I want to install it? Well, I'm going to use an external hard drive or shared network folder. This shared network folder will be accessible to both my new computer and my old computer. I'm going to choose a network folder. Well, I'm going to map a network. Actually, I'm going to map a network drive. Drive Z is going to connect to the GM-DC to the C drive of the domain controller. And you'll see here now that I've got a few folders here. I'm going to make a new folder called Transfer, just so that I have a place to put all this stuff. So I'm going to put it right there. I'm going to put it on the GM-DC server, which is the domain controller for this site, in a folder called Transfer. Windows Easy Transfer is now going to get copied over to that location. And now I'm going to have to open this folder and follow these instructions from the old computer. So I'm going to switch over to a Windows XP machine and I'm going to connect to that location. I want to view this full screen. So I'm going to map a network drive. So I'm going to the Start menu, right-clicking my computer and choosing Map Network Drive. And I'm going to connect drive Z to GMDC $/transfer. And I'm going to double-click the Windows Easy Transfer shortcut. So now it's going to tell me to wait while this process runs. And you're going to see a familiar screen that we just saw. So I'm going to click the next button, choose network, and I'm going to choose this is my old computer. So I'm now on my old computer and it's telling me, okay, now go back over to your other machine and open with Windows Easy Transfer. And when I get over there, type this code, 937628. So I'm going to go do that. So I'll click next, 937-628, and next. So the two computers were able to talk to one another, and now they're checking for compatibility. It's looking to see what can be transferred between the systems. Now there's multiple user accounts on that system. There's the Global Mantix Administrator account. There's the Scott account. There's the Global Mantix Scott account. And there's some shared items. I wonder if there's anything happening on the screen on the other side. Not much. On the old computer, you're told, don't use this computer during the transfer. View the progress on the new computer instead. So we're going to do that. And what do I want to move? So do I want to move everything? Do I want to move my desktop items, my favorites, my documents, my music, my pictures, quick launch items, program settings, Windows settings, other items? Or you can modify your selections. Do you want to move your start menu items? All kinds of stuff you can do here. You can move specific favorites. You don't have to move all of your favorites. So one of the things you're going to see with Windows Easy Transfer is you don't actually have to move everything. It's not an all or nothing proposition. You can choose which user accounts you want to migrate the data for. Inside those user accounts, you can decide what to move and what not to move, right down to the individual items. So this is a pretty powerful tool. Now, because these are very new virtual machines, there's not a whole lot to move. So I'm going to let it move everything, and I'll click Transfer. And it's going to tell me, don't use this computer until it's done. So I won't. And it should be a relatively quick process because these are connected by a very, very fast network. So we'll let this process run. Now, if you're wondering what happened and why this taskbar changed back to something, it's because the user settings for the administrator user on the Windows XP machine did not have the clock and date disabled. Only the Scott account had that stuff disabled. So my Windows settings transferred, and you were able to see it actually take effect on the fly. That was very intentional. I wasn't using the administrator account on the Windows XP side of the house. I was using only the Scott account. On the Windows 7 machine, I was using the administrator account, and it moved it transferred the settings, which included viewing the clock, from that machine over to the new Windows 7 machine. Now I can take a look at what was transferred. So there were 3 user accounts transferred, 63 documents were transferred. Some program settings were transferred. So, in Microsoft Office, you have your dictionary and you have your Outlook account information, and you have all kinds of customizations that you've made over the years to that stuff. You don't want to lose all that. Well, this process will move it all for you. And 3 user accounts were moved. Scott transferred to Scott, GM Administrator, and you'll see basically the list that we saw. Now, I was going to tell you there's a few features of Windows XP that are not included in the version of Windows, including Outlook Express and Movie Maker. And you're going to see that there are some software that were installed on the old system that's not installed on the new system, including, well, not necessarily installed, but like Office 2007 is not yet installed on the Windows 7 machine, but Internet Explorer 8 is. What's a list of programs I might want to install on my new computer? Well, that's the same place we were just at. So this is going to tell you exactly what you need to know. So I'm going to restart the system. And when it comes back up, we'll just make sure that the documents themselves moved as well. We got to see that the system said that a whole bunch of this stuff moved, and you got to see the taskbar actually change on the fly. But let's see if the documents came over for the Scott user as well. The Scott user on Windows XP had 3 documents in its documents folder. Let's go take a look what we have here. So I'm going to log in as the Global Mantic Scott user. Actually, I'm going to log in as administrator. Make sure we can see everything. I'm going to type the password right this time too. So we'll go to the Start menu, go to Documents. So what we see here are the documents that were actually transferred over. So this is exactly what we were hoping to see, is that the documents that were saved in the My Documents folder were actually moved over to the new system. Pretty cool stuff. Good tool. There is another tool that will perform a similar function. It's called the User State Migration tool, and this automates user profile migration, and it's well suited for large-scale migrations. Think tens, hundreds, or thousands of users moving from Windows XP to Windows 7. The User State Migration tool does not support the Windows Easy Transfer cable. You really need to use a network for the User State Migration tool. It is a part of what's called the Windows Automated Installation Toolkit, or the WAIK, or WAKE. The User State Migration tool will not be covered in this lesson, but we will discuss it in the lesson entitled Deploying Windows 7 Machines. We covered a lot in this Installing Windows 7 lesson, including going over Windows 7 requirements, understanding its upgrade and migration limitations, and what it takes to upgrade between Windows 7 editions. You'll learn how to install Windows 7, upgrade Windows Vista to Windows 7, and you'll learn how to dual boot Windows XP and Windows 7 so you can go back and forth between the operating systems at will. You then learn how to migrate user profiles with the Windows Easy Transfer tool, and got to see just how easy it was to get documents from an old version of Windows to a brand new version of Windows. We finished up by touching on the User State Migration tool as a teaser item for the Deploying Windows 7 lesson. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.